With the motion that the war journalists should be forced to reveal their sources in international criminal tribunals when trying cases in war crimes and crimes against genocide, we stand with the definitions that international criminal tribunals are legal institutions that are international in which criminals are tried, especially international criminals. War crimes are crimes. War crimes are crimes that are committed in war that violate the international laws regarding how wars should be fought. And crimes against genocide are crimes that involve the killing or intention to and partly killing of a single ethnicity. We come to this debate with the model that we see in history. It is often the winners that write history, and also it is the winners that and it is also the winners that write the evidence that creates the history. And in trials after war, typically the political matters often matters more than the actual legal jurisdiction and what is right and what is wrong. With these sources being shown, we think that there will be, first, less doubt in the legal jurisdiction, and second of all, less false accusations. And this, in the end, will improve the justice and credibility of these international criminal tribunals. With this metric of improving the rightfulness of justice and credibility in these international criminal tribunals, I want this debate to be weighed in. There are many stakeholders in today's debate. The first of them is the journalist who wish to present cases to the court and so that those who have committed the war crimes will be tried accordingly and fairly. The second is the victims of the war crime who wishes for the criminals of the war crime to be tried accordingly and fairly. And third is the international criminal tribunals who wish to also try these criminals fairly and with justice. So, Judge, it is clear to see that improving the rightfulness of justice and credibility in these international criminal tribunals is what needs to be focused on. And this is what I wish for today's debate to be weighed in. Now, I would like to continue on to my first argument, which is consistency. In civil and domestic courts, lawyers must present the evidence that they shows source. In the legal processes, consistency is important to keep a consistent level of justice across the world and across different legal systems. And as we can see, there is no reason for inconsistency of civil and domestic court and the civil and domestic court and the court and international criminal tribunals. And thus, it should be for the sake of justice and for the sake of keeping a consistent legal system that lawyers must present the evidence's source. My second argument, my second argument is truth and justice. In this truth and justice, when the evidence is presented to the court, the evidence is either made up or it is true. If the evidence is true, then once the source of the evidence is shown, there will be more credibility into the truth of the evidence and thus will create a better and more compelling case. A better and more compelling case on its own means that the victims get justice and people are more likely to trust the victims as they suffer the crime. For example, in terms of Holocaust deniers, I'm sure that if there is no concrete evidence, if the source of the evidence that was used to try these people who have committed the Holocaust, if the source of the evidence that was used to try these people who have committed the Holocaust was not shown, I'm sure that people will be much less likely to believe that the Holocaust will actually happened. And thus naturally, when the source of the evidence is shown, the victims of the war crime will get more justice and people will be more likely to actually believe in this legal jurisdiction and in the end for this legal jurisdiction to become more credible. The second situation is if the evidence is made up. In which case, if the source of the evidence was unable to be presented, then the international criminal tribunals will actually know that this evidence it is not credible due to the fact that the journalists have refused to present the source of the evidence, and thus the amount of wrong and politically related accusations that do not fit the metrics of justice that we have given will be decreased. Why? Because when the international criminal tribunals know that this evidence is made up and not actually true, they will be less likely to sentence that person specifically onto this crime in which if the journalist is politically motivated to simply get that person being tried into prison, regardless of the fact that that person did not commit a crime, then the international criminal tribunals will actually know, and they will actually, and thus naturally the amount of wrong accusations, the amount of wrong sentences, and the amount of politically influenced sentencings will be decreased. POIs. So no POI.
Sorry, that is
Now I
out
would
of
like
order.
to now I would like to move on to my third argument, which is better journalists. Because of the fact that credible sources, and because of the fact that you will now have to show the source of your evidence, there will be more encouragement for journalists to actually use more credible sources due to the fact that more credible sources will stand stronger in court, and that will increase the credibility of the journalists in the future. This will promote the use of more credible sources in journalism and in court, meaning that more and more journalists will use better and more credible sources, which will allow for a generally better level of journalism. And Judge, this is why we strongly urge for a government ballot in today's debate. Thank you.
I'll be first doing some basic refutation and then next providing the two contentions that we mainly have. So first, also before that, I'll also first be providing the characterization of the main stakeholders inside of this round. The other side has presented the main stakeholders as the victims of the crime and the journalists. However, we disagree with that. We tell you that because this round is focused around the war journalists and their sources, we argue that the actually main stakeholders in this round and the ones that we should be focusing on are the war journalists and the sources of the information. So first, war journalists. They want to report international issues while facing stress to their lives. They are the ones who help provide the evidence in international criminal tribunals. So they want more sources of information and more events to report in order to, one, expose the truth of certain countries, second, also get more sources in the future and basically benefit the newspaper overall. Next to the sources. The sources are typically people who are hiding their own identity in order to expose certain events to journalists were these happening to be punished. Before we mention why the sources might be wanting to do that, let's characterize war crimes. War crimes, as the other side has already stated, are basically like crimes against humanity or genocide, etc. So basically, the people who commit these acts will know that they will get severely punished by international law. So they will try to numb the information about their acts and leak out by either threatening witnesses or, in the worst case, killing them. That's basically why these sources want to hide their own identity, because when they actually expose their own identities, they know that their lives are to some extent at stake, and so therefore they will actually use a lot of for example, safety measures in order to prevent their own lives from being at stake, like for example, not even exposing information in the first place. Therefore, in order to ensure that a lot of war crimes are actually being presented in the International Criminal Court, we must make sure that the stakeholders are safe and aren't having their lives being threatened by the process of this kind of reporting. Therefore, we tell you that the other side's point is not stand to that extent. So basically, the other side is repeatedly talking about how the sources must be presented because, for example, evidence might be made up or they might have better journalists overall. But sources already have an incentive to not have their own identities be leaked. If you actually leak their identities, you're basically violating their own trust towards the journalists, and that basically means that there won't be any journalism in the future because other sources know that their identities will be leaked as soon as they start talking about some certain top secret information. Then they will just stop trying to even expose this phenomenon in the first place. They'll stop even trying to have any reporting happen, and that will basically cause like huge effects. For example, you won't have any like exposure of like war crimes. No war crimes will even be exposed solely because people are afraid of their own lives being at stake. So therefore, let's bring on our two main contentions, and some rebuttal will be integrated into these contentions too. Our contentions are mainly like centered around these two like a stakeholder. So first is harm to journalists. The sources typically trust the journalists to keep their own identity secret by forcefully revealing their own identities. The government is violating the trust of the sources. Was that a POI?
Yeah, POI.
Three.
Yeah, POI.
Yeah,
Okay,
I
so
accept that.
so when war journalists don't report war crimes, so what alternative solution do you propose to solve the war crimes like problems?
We're talking about okay. You probably misunderstood what we're talking about. Inside of your situation, inside of your world, that is a world in which war journalists will not report war crimes because the sources are afraid of their own identities being leaked out, and then that might cause them to be, for example, killed or murdered. Because the people who committed the war crimes don't want the war crimes or don't want their own identities to be leaked in that case. Because the sources might have their own lives at stake, and they don't want their own lives at stake, right? Nobody wants to be killed just because they're trying to expose some certain phenomena. So they won't even tell journalists about the happenings. They won't tell war journalists about these kind of like Holocaust events. So no journalism will happen on your side of the world. On our side of the world, because we have safety for the journalists and for the sources, there will be more reporting. So next, going on to continue elaboration of our first contention. So basically, what we're talking about is that the sources typically cause the journalists to like keep their own identity secret, right? So the journalists reveal the sources of the information, and if they're like forced to reveal the sources of information, which may be spies located in certain countries, other spies and other people who may provide them with the certain information will be unwilling to continue providing them with that kind of like information in the future because they don't want their identity to be leaked. Therefore, keeping the identities of the sources secret would benefit journalists by encouraging other potential sources of information to continue providing the journalists with information because they know that they will be safe even if they expose extremely shocking information. Second, harm to sources. If people who commit these acts will know that they will get severely punished by international law. Like people who commit these war crimes, they know that they will definitely have like death penalties or sentences in jail or torture or whatever. So like they'll probably get severely punished. So they try to not let information about their action leak out because they don't want to like nobody wants to be put inside of a jail for the rest of their life, right? So they'll probably try to not let information about their actions leak out by either threatening witnesses or, in the worst case, killing them. Once the sources get released on court, nearly everyone will know about like the source because it's the International Criminal Court or other kinds of tribunals. So like both sides agree on these kind of like international courts are international and they're like legal institutions. They're like really huge, and most of the time stuff that happens there get reported almost everywhere. That basically means that like the person who is like the source will probably get known like worldwide as a person who exposed some like war criminals like basically happenings, etc. Nearly everyone will know about the source, including the accused and the accused accomplices that may be hidden. In order to prevent future information leakage about the crime, some criminals might try to deal with the witness or the source of the information. So, for example, by threatening them, blackmailing them, or even by killing them. So overall, by basically forcing the journalists to reveal their sources, it will cause harm to both the journalists and the sources because the criminals, the war criminals, the ones who are like being exposed, they have an incentive to not get exposed in that case. And they will do like literally everything in order to like not get exposed. So basically through that process, you can see how it's extremely important to allow like journalists to keep their own sources secret in order to prevent like danger to themselves and the sources, and also to continue valued reporting. So that we can also think about the other side's points. They're talking about how there will be better journalism, but what about like the sources? Everyone can invent a so-called credible source. Everyone can invent the kinds of like happening that has happened, and they just like create a random source, etc. Everyone can do that. There's no link between like having a source and then also having better journalism. But then on the other hand, on our side of the world, we do have credible sources. Besides like sources, or knowing the source of like the information isn't the only way to prove that the information is true. For example, you can also look at different kinds of evidence that's happened, like forensic evidence or like fingerprints, etc. You can look at all these kinds of evidence and you still have to focus on the source. Just because like there's a lot of different ways to like be able to see whether or not a thing is true. And of course, in that case, revealing their sources in international war tribunals is not a wonderful way to do that. In order to make sure that like there's more valid reporting in the future, we should vote for opposition. Thank you.
Okay, so firstly, I'd like to offer some rebuttals to our judge.
So, firstly, our opponents are saying that people want to kill witnesses, lives are being threatened, and it's not in the stakeholders' best interest as they introduce a new stakeholder in this debate: sources. Now, Judge, let us prove to you why our side also benefits this new introduced stakeholder: sources. So, our opponents are saying how information will be leaked and these lives will be threatened. However, they undermine the entire concept and benefit that these journalists enjoy. One of the main benefits that these war journalists enjoy is their protection, because these war journalists actually have protection in the field, and you will see, Judge, that rarely. Okay, so what our opponents undermine is the fact that these journalists are protected. There is a huge backlash to these journalists if they are killed in this scenario. So, and since our opponents mentioned how these legal institutions are so huge, they obviously would have enough resources to protect these sources. And sources are not often just left in their place; they will be put in the court themselves. So, in fact, we don't believe that these people will be likely to be killed as much as these journalists who are in fact exposing the truth. So, our opponents are also saying that journalists will be, due to their identities being leaked, less journalists will try due to lives at stake. However, we've already mentioned that these journalists, our opponents, failed to understand that these journalists are often protected by legal institutions, as it is the legal institutions' best interest to put justice to these people, and therefore it is also their best interest to protect these journalists as their goals align in this scenario. So our opponents also are saying that there will be harm to sources. However, we have already mentioned that these legal institutions will have enough resources to protect these sources. Our opponents are saying that since there's large international institutions, they will get known worldwide. However, isn't it the best interest of these sources to get known in only internally in these international institutions, since these people's suffering has to be understood. It is very hard for someone to understand the full suffering of someone unless you actually are able to see them. This emotional impact not only hugely impacts the amount of justice that is put into these international institutions, but also helps gain sympathy and maybe allocated resources to these people to in fact increase their mental health, etc., etc. Not only this, but our opponents are saying that these sources um, have an incentive to be true. However, in this case, our opponents have failed to understand our like contention. Our contention was the fact that they will not even have sources; they will just make up their own. So we believe that our contention still stands, since our opponents have failed to fully rebut or understand our contention. So our opponents also said that overall in our world there will be less justice. However, we already proved to you how legal institutions have the same incentives as journalists, so they would be able to protect them and the sources and therefore the best interest in this debate. Our opponents are also undermining the entire value of the victims of war crime, since we already proved to you how we will actually prove more justice as compared to forensic data, because forensic data can only be interpreted by other people, which by other specific people with like, and it's basically very highly specialized data that only few people can read in this scenario.
You know
So
why?
in fact, yes.
Considering that this is inside of an international court that has a lot of experts, why won't the experts be able to understand the forensic data?
So usually in courts, these are legal experts such as lawyers. However, forensic data experts are in a completely different field, and therefore the court cases will be less likely to have forensic data experts as compared to lawyers and juries. So moving on to my point, we believe that this actually does not benefit the international criminal tribunals, as they would instead allocate more resources to forensic data and evidence as compared to data directly from these sources. Now, while our opponents um, so basically, in our scenario, we are providing less resources for the same amount of justice as compared to our opponents, who are having a much more costly and, in the end of the day, a less benefiting scenario on their side in this debate. Um, so let me continue off our opponent's, my own side's contention. So we show you better journalists and how the more credible sources will be used. However, we also want to add that not only will more credible sources be used because, for example, we will be more likely to include a source who is who has a more detailed account, or maybe is older as compared to a child, which has very subjective views. Well, we will also show that we will have better journalists, as now better journalists who win cases with correct information will be more prominent in this industry. We would also provide that these better journalists will be more likely to be out in the war, getting better information, and um, and therefore getting more credible data, and therefore encouraging the right amount breed of journalists. So our opponents are that basically these journalists need a free press. However, and our opponents are saying that lives are being threatened, but clearly, Judge, you see these problems and concerns are misplaced, as legal institutions definitely have the resources to provide for the sources and these journalists. So as you can see, Judge, we provide a better justice system for all, and not only this, but we provide a better compensation to the victims and the sources, as they will be more prominent. We also provide the right breed of journalists. We also provide the in the International Criminal Tribunal's best interest, as we will be allocating less resources to get the same amount of justice. So as you can see, Judge, our side should clearly win this debate, since um, we clearly address the stakeholders, and we are arguing for their best interest.
So in my speech, Judge, I'll mainly provide a new argument and then provide some refutation into the other side, as in the term of all the stakeholders under this motion, including theirs and ours. So first, a new extension is that journalists, they have a freedom of right or autonomy to choose whether to release sources or not, because it's actually a right to privacy for those sources to not actually get released their own identity, even if it's on a court itself, because there may be many sources and there may be a threat to the sources themselves, which I'll explain a little bit more later. So these journalists, they actually have freedom to choose whether they would release exactly who these sources are, what kind of witnesses they are, and what kind of people they are, like their exact identity. So it's a term of these journalists. They do have a right or freedom of autonomy to actually choose whether or not to release it on court. In these sources, they also have a right to choose whether I want to reveal my actual identity as well, whether they want to reveal who I am, because not everybody is actually exactly that comfortable with telling the whole court or international court who I am and where do I live and what kind of experience did I exactly have. Well, it may be useful for them to review their experiences, but may not actually be useful to review exactly what's their identity, while it could actually, in a way, threaten them. Okay, so I'll move on to some refutations. So understanding the main stakeholders in this debate. So the other side provided a stakeholder talking about journalists and talking about those victims and those sources. And our main focus is harms to journalists and harms to the sources themselves. And then one by the stakeholders. So first, the other side is bringing up a stakeholder called the victim, talking about victims getting more justice because there's more credible sources. First one, I want to address a point here, is that the problem of not credible sources happens on both sides and is pretty much symmetric. Even if Judge, the other side says that journalists must reveal their sources and exactly who these sources are and their identity, there's still a problem when it comes to witnesses. Anybody can potentially invent sources and information that seems credible when it comes to witnesses, because the only reason why we're believing witnesses is because, well, like they actually swore that they will tell the truth, but who says they tell the truth? Even if they actually want to tell the truth, occasionally it is possible that witnesses invent data or not data, evidence inadvertently because of memory and psychological issues. I'm not sure exactly how to explain that in a very technical way, but basically is that once some people get some hint of a horror crime or something that's happening, they could possibly invent the rest of the story by themselves and see it as credible in a way. So these kind of uncredible sources could exist on both sides. Just by releasing these sources and exactly what is their identity, and won't exactly solve the problem when it comes to these witnesses who can always potentially invent sources and information. Well, the victim credibility and victim closure will happen on both sides, so potentially is not a unique argument. And the problem of not credible resources can actually happen on both sides. And moving on to another stakeholder the other side also cares about is the journalists. They say that we have better journalists who use more credible sources because they're like required to reveal sources. Just as I said again, required to review sources does not necessarily mean that these sources are automatically credible. Just by telling you who you are doesn't mean that you are a credible source. Well, this may seem a little bit controversial to witnesses, but that's actually the truth, Judge. When it comes to seeing these witnesses and these people that could potentially invent sources that could happen on both sides, even if we're telling them to review sources. Lots of these uncredible witnesses also do happen occasionally in actual real-life criminal court cases when it comes to even if the whole court knows who they are, like what kind of person they are and what did they experience during the time of crime. They may also potentially invent sources because of their own memory, adding details to story that may not always be true. And this can happen inadvertently whether these people actually want to provide genuine information in the first place. So what did our site provide about journalists is that journalists actually have an incentive to hide their identity and the identity of their sources. This is where I'll explain more about the harm to sources themselves. The other side says that there will be huge backlash if these sources or these journalists will be killed because and there will be huge backlash by the international community, and there will be protection of war journalists and for the from the international court. So first, Judge, we want to notice that the other side only tells us about the protection of war journalists. Well, that may be true, but what about the sources themselves? Even if we buy the whole point to say that, oh, we will protect war sources, war journalists, and there's also still a problem of sources. Even if we can still say that we protect sources, can you protect them for their whole entire life? The problem is with this, with maybe not killing them, but actually threatening them or blackmailing them, as my partner has briefly mentioned when it comes to harm to sources. Maybe they will not outright kill them, but they will threaten them or blackmail them to not further reveal any information. It just comes to, for example, when after the Rwandan genocide, many potential witnesses, because there are so many people that could be tried, so the international court adopted a faster way of trialing. So in a way, when it comes to these these cases of lots of people lots of people committing war crimes or crimes against humanity or genocide, these kind of things, these witnesses could potentially be subdued to not speak up or basically hide their identities because they're threatened or blackmailed or in any other way threatened for their lives. So these kind of things do happen, even if we say that we want to protect sources. How is it sure that we protect them for their whole entire life? And then the second problem is with organized crime, is that when seldom people actually who commit war crimes are like one person or two people. There may be multiple people, and there may be a huge organization just like Nazis. So these organizations of crime, they could potentially threaten these sources for their whole entire life, because how are you sure that everybody in that organization is actually captured or potentially sentenced to life sentence? And even if they're not sentenced to or even if they're sentenced, they may not be life sentence or a death penalty. They may just walk out someday to avenge or possibly their organization. There's some people who are really crazy inside those organizations, and they are just devout to say that I want revenge for my organization because that witness or that source actually leaked out our information. And you can't essentially prevent these things from happening for the source's whole life. That's why this huge actually chance of these things happening could just de-incentivize war journalists and sources to review anything. Remember, Judge, it is the key of the sources because they have to review anything before war journalists report anything. That's why when their safety is threatened, we can't be sure that they will consent to giving anything. Okay.
My name is Simon Post and a fellow debater. It's time before you today to make a case that war journalists must be compelled to reveal their sources when testifying in international criminal tribunals, including the International Criminal Court, in cases involving war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is a critical issue that goes to the heart of accountability of the most heinous acts of violence and oppression. While the principle of protecting journalist sources is an important one, it cannot and should not be absolute when the stakes are so high and the need of justice is so compelling. I will summarize the clashes in this debate. The first clash is whether war journalists revealing their sources to international criminal tribunals will actually solve the problem and lead to justice. When war crimes and crimes against humanity are committed, those responsible must be held to account, as stated multiple times before. Perpetrators of genocide, ethnic cleansing, Tudor, mass murder, and other such atrocities cannot be allowed to evade justice. And in many cases, the testimony and evidence provided by war journalists is absolutely essential to building out right cases against these individuals. Journalists who have cultivated relationships with sources within military rebel groups or repressive regimes often have access to information and documentation that is simply unavailable through other channels. Journalists may have interviewed eyewitnesses, obtained leaked documents, or been granted access to closed-door meetings and activities. This kind of first-hand, on-to-the-ground information reporting is invaluable in establishing the facts of what transpired, the who, what, where, when, and how the war crimes. Shielding these sources from security means depriving international tribunals of crucial evidence and allowing perpetrators to potentially escape accountability. Our opponents said that war journalists will make up things. However, that will simply not happen because war journalists, they have like the certain amount of credibility, and you have to believe in them. And furthermore, consider the hypothetical scenario. A war journalist embedded with government forces witnessed soldiers similarly executing civilians. They obtained corroborated testimony from local residents as well as medical records and photographic evidence of the autopsy. The journalists then tried to protect the identities of their sources within the military when called to testify at the ICC. By doing so, they risk allowing these responsible to avoid prosecution and denying justice to the victims and their families. This is not an isolated example. In the former Yugoslavia, Rwanda, Darfur, and elsewhere, war reporting has been instrumental in documenting and exposing horrific war crimes. Journalists have interviewed victims, obtained documentary proof, and risked their lives to shed light on these abuses. To then allow them to shield their sources from security is to undermine the entire international justice system. Some may argue that this would have a chilling effect on press freedom and make it harder for journalists to get access to information in conflict zones. However, the concern is that sources will be less willing to come forward if they know their identities could be revealed. However, I urge our opponents and all these people to recognize that the gravity of the crimes being investigated and the imperative of ensuring accountability must take precedence and priority. If we accept that journalists can never be compelled to reveal their sources, no matter how heinous the aligned crimes, then we are essentially creating a get out of jail free card for the worst human right abusers. They will know that as long as they can keep their activities surrounded in security, the international community will be unable to build a sufficient case against them. This is an unconceivable outcome that we cannot accept, no matter what. Now, I recognize that there may be cases where journalist sources could face retaliation, imprisonment, or even execution, as mentioned by our opponents, if their identity is revealed. This is a legitimate concern that must be weighed carefully. However, I would argue that in the most egregious cases of war crimes, the societal interest in seeing justice served outweighs the risk of an individual source. And there may be ways to protect sources' identities in some degree, such as redacting names or allowing testimony in closed session. Moreover, international tribunals already have regular standards and processes for evaluating evidence and safeguarding the integrity of the proceedings. They are not going to simply take journalists' world at face value, nor are they going to recklessly expose innocent people to harm. Therefore, it is justice. Yeah.
Why is knowing the source vital to like being able to prove the source? Like you have a lot of other evidence. Why do you need to know the source of the information?
Sorry, opponents, can you please repeat your question? I don't really understand.
Okay, so to restate it, why do you need to know the source of the information to make sure that the source is valid? To ensure that the information is valid?
We never said that we need to know the sources of the information. We're just saying that the sources of the information that like the criminal that like these journalists report, they will be kept into account, and they will not be spread to the public. So therefore, it will not lead to these safety issues. And moving on to my case, we must also consider the devastating toll that war crimes and crimes against humanity take on individuals, families, and entire communities. So basically, we tell you that the pain and suffering inflicted is almost unimaginable. Rape, torture, mass murder, these are not abstract concepts, but the lives experienced by millions of people, such as the people suffering from the Israel and Palestine war, and the people suffering from the Ukraine and Russian war. And when the perpetrators of these horrors are allowed to evade justice, it compounds the trauma and denies closures to the victims. And the second clash is, as I stated before, whether these people will risk their lives and risk their identities being leaked out. So, however, I would argue that even in cases where sources' identities may be at risk, the overriding imperative of ensuring accountability for war crimes and crimes against humanity should take precedence. So let me be clear: I do not discount the very real dangers that sources may and could face if their identities are revealed. We have seen countless examples throughout history of whistleblowers, informants, and witnesses being targeted of reprisals, whether it's imprisonment, torture, or even execution. And I acknowledge that this chilling effect could have a profound negative impact on journalists' ability to gather critical information on conflict zones. But I would counter that the international criminal justice system already has robust mechanisms in place to protect vulnerable witnesses and safeguard sensitive information, as repeatedly stated by my teammate. Tribunals like the ICC readily utilize measures such as witness relocation, face and voice distortion, and closed-door taxonomy to shield the identities to those who come forward. The reputation that even lives of these individuals are always top priority. And furthermore, let's consider the worst case scenario. Even if these journalists' identities get leaked out, first they will still be protected, like the American government. They will still be protected, minute and every single minute and every single second to maintain that their identity and they will not. And furthermore, second, is it more valuable and important to save the millions and billions of people suffering from these war crimes and these crimes at the expense of one individual's source? Basically, consider all the people suffering from the Palestine and Israel war, and consider the millions and billions of people suffering from the Russian and Ukraine war. Should you prioritize risking your own expense and to solve these issues of these like heinous wars? Obviously, you should prioritize these wars at the expense, and furthermore, you will still be protected, and there will still be voices that will maintain that you will still be safe, right? And based on these, we urge for a strong government ballot. Thank you.
Firstly, we'd like to clarify our opponent's answer to the POI that our side asked. Our opponent responded by you do not need to know the source in order to know the credibility of the source. So what this shows is that without knowing the source, we can still know the credibility of the source, meaning that we do not need to force these journalists to reveal these sources in order to achieve the impact such as credibility that our opponents are talking about according to their own answer towards our POI. So today, this debate comes down to the having of justice along with the protecting of along with the protecting of the journalists from our side, while on our opponent's side sacrificing the safety of the journalists and the sources in order to have possibly some kind of justice towards these victims and journalists. So today we're going to weigh firstly on justice. Firstly, as our opponent stated, we do not need to know the source in order to recognize the credibility of the source. So this means that, without knowing the source, there can still be justice. We do believe that is so. That is so because, the International Criminal Justice Court, they can have the basic ability to tell the justice or tell the credibility of one source. Moreover, we also argue that this kind of justice is symmetric of the credibility of sources, and this kind of sort of wrong sources lead to injustice can be symmetric on both sides. Why is that so? That is because even if our opponents accuse us that in our world, journalists might make up evidence, we argue that in their world, there can also be sources that are made up, or sources that are incredible, that are not credible. So this proves that this problem of not credible sources that leads to injustice is actually a clear on both sides. But why is our side doing better? And that is because firstly, we see that our side already have this, the criminal justice court can already tell whether these sources are credible or not. Moreover, we see that by protecting these sources and protecting these journalists and causing them to have less this kind of mental burden or this fear that they might be attacked because of their personal information is leaked, we see that under this more protective environment where journalists feel a greater sense of safety, they are more likely to present better information instead of being constantly feeling under threat or leading to this kind of great levels of anxiety in these in both sources and these journalists, which can lead which can actually lead to less credible sources because of under this great pressure that is constantly on them. So with that is about justice as well as credibility. And this point, since we are the ones that can essentially benefit more of justice and more credibility and provide better sources, this point will go towards our side. The second point that we're going to weigh between our opponents and our side is the safety of journalists as well as sources. So our opponents argue that these journalists as well as sources would be able to be protected by the would be able to be protected internationally. But we say that is not the case. As our second speaker has already stated, no, this protection of these sources might on journalists might mean we're not going to find any ways of killing them or or preventing any physical harm to them. But like this does not mean that these journalists or sources would definitely be no, would definitely be close to any harm. For example, as we've already mentioned in our case, and as like extended by our second speaker, these witnesses, these sources, and these journalists could be possibly open to things such as threatening and blackmailing. So this means that in any way, even with protection, these journalists are likely to be threatened in these ways. So what does this threat lead to? This threat, as we have already stated before, this threat can possibly lead to, for example, like a mental anxiety, like physical, like this kind of like trauma or a fear of releasing any more sources, in the fear that they will still keep on getting threatened because like their identity is leaked and they do not want that. So this is the world our opponents are essentially presenting. Like in this world where like people are constantly afraid that their information will be leaked and constantly and under anxiety. On the other hand, our world, we are keeping the identity of sources secret, and thus would benefit journalists by encouraging like other potential sources of information to continue to providing the journalists with information, because they know that they will be safe even if they continue on to expose this kind of information, this kind of credible but probably shocking information. So on our hand, we firstly ensure the safety of journalists, meaning that in our world, we benefit the journalists and the sources in terms of safety, and thus will lead to them presenting more credible sources. So the point about benefiting journalists as well as sources will also turn to our side. But moreover, Judge, we argue that we essentially win over our opponents on a greater degree, because like we are the ones that are offering this free choice towards these journalists, because like in their world, they are forcing these journalists to definitely expose their sources. But in our world, we do not force them to do so, but we do not refrain them from doing so either. So which means like these journalists, they, as our second speaker already stated, these journalists, they can choose to expose these sources if they feel that like these sources might be susceptible to challenge, or the stating of this source is extremely important for justice on the court. So if the journalists feel as releasing this kind of sources, we believe, as our second speaker already stated, we believe that they can have the freedom to release this kind of sources. But we do not like deny the other world where journalists might feel that they are like under pressure, or might feel that it is unnecessary or not beneficial to them to release these sources. So we believe that under this world, we present, as our side is uniquely presenting these journalists with a choice of whether to release or not to release, and we are giving these journalists like sources a way out, like saying that they have the freedom of choice to not to release these sources. So essentially, we win over our opponents because we have better credibility, more safety, and more benefits towards towards journalists and sources, and also more freedom towards these stakeholders. Thank you.
So to address the main two clashes in debate, Judge, and to say that we have already won this debate. So first class about affordability and those victims itself. The other side has said so many times in their first speech that we must need to punish war crimes because there's so many people suffering. Outside doesn't disagree with that. We just disagree with the way that we need to do that with sources. The other side says that we need the credible sources, so we need them to reveal sources. Two problems with that. First, they already said in their first speech as a response to our side's POI that we don't need sources to know. So that just contradicts your whole entire point, and it just falls to that one sentence that we don't need sources to know. And then second, even if we say that contradictory piece doesn't exist, just revealing sources doesn't necessarily actually lead to more credible sources. Just as I have said in my own rebuttal speech, just saying that, oh, I tell you who I am and I tell you what exactly that I experienced, and doesn't mean that these sources are just credible. And the punishment of war crimes does exist on our side. Simply because we don't reveal sources does not mean that the punishment of war crimes simply don't exist anymore. There are still so many witnesses when it comes to war crimes and things that are huge, like genocide. We don't need to review exactly what everybody in the source is in those cases. We still can punish war crimes. These victims are not going into a vacuum, but as punishing war crimes just happens on both sides. And why isn't there other ways to expose these kind of war crimes, like forensic evidence? The other side says that, oh, courts don't have that many forensic experts, so they don't know exactly what the data is. I can just contradict that by saying that it's empirically untrue that courts don't have forensic experts, because forensic data is so important in so many court cases, especially when it comes to criminal court cases. So the court is bound to have a forensic expert. If the court itself doesn't have a forensic, and they just invite one over and ask them to interpret the data for them. That's so easy to do, because when it comes to international courts, we can invite so many experts from so many countries, and this and that just disproves the fact that the point that forensic data just can't be read and can't be understood. That's just a really big alternative that's even more credible, because people could possibly invent sources that seem credible, while forensic data has much less possibility of being not credible. So in this case, the credibility exists on our side, and the victim closure also exists on our side as well. And their side can't absolutely assume that we can reveal sources, then it means that the sources will be credible. That just simply isn't true. And that's why we believe that clash could possibly be a tie, because credibility and victim closure exist on both sides. Second, the clash, journalists and the source. This is where we win the debate, Judge, because we have already proven this can be a harm to journalists and sources, because there's an active incentive for criminal organizations who committed war crimes and crimes of humanity to hide their crimes and thus cause huge harms through threatening or blackmailing or possibly killing journalists and sources. And the main problem is with sources. The other side says that, oh, we can just protect them because international court is big, and we can protect journalists and we can protect sources. I already questioned this in my second speech, that can you always protect them? Always protect them when it comes to organizations. Somebody can in fact go on with vengeance for their own organization, and still that's going to threaten these people. And we already mentioned the mere possibility, as a third speaker said, the mere possibility of being threatened or being harmed in these kind of cases can just disincentivize people. Even if police go around and tell you as a witness that we will always protect you, you don't have to worry, some witnesses still believe that there is a possibility that somebody else in the accused accomplices may actually break free, and they may actually provide vengeance on me. That mere possibility of being threatened just disincentivizes so many sources to disclose exactly what do they have to say. And then lastly, with their freedom of choice to choose whether to disclose, we could also get credible sources. Thank you.
Now, I would like to do the speech by analyzing the various clashes that have gone up in today's debate. The first clash is the protection of the victim. First of all, our opponents claim that we cannot protect the victim. However, clearly we can. We can place them in a safe house. We can place them with guards surrounding them so that it is difficult for people to actually harm them. And even if this is not true, as our opponent claims, we can very much just move them to a safer country or a safer place. For example, a witness of the Rwandan genocide, that person can just go to, let's say, the United States or Australia to stay there until it is safe for them to go other places. And even if this is not true, it is ultimately justice that matters more. As we will state later, it is much more credible for evidence to be shown when the source is much more credible for evidence when the source is shown. And without the source, it is very much unclear whether the evidence is true or made up. Which leads us to a second clash. Evidence could be made up. Our opponent claims that our evidence could be made up by the sources, and even if we reveal the sources, the evidence's truthfulness does not improve at all. However, we would like to respond to this. Yes, we admit that the evidence could be made up. However, if we have to force the journalist to show the source of the evidence, and the source of the evidence is someone politically motivated to make up the evidence, then clearly the evidence will have much less credibility. And moreover, our opponent also kept mentioning forensic evidence and other types of evidence. However, if the source of such evidence is not mentioned, then still this evidence could still be made up, nevertheless. And so we have proven that it is also that we can protect the victim, and also the evidence could be made up on our side, but the evidence is more likely to be made up on their side. The second of the clashes which is evidence could be made up, have proved the first clash, and its reasoning regarding that justice ultimately is more important than protecting the victim. Now, there is also journalist freedom, in which our opposition stated that journalists should be free to reveal the sources if they want. Well, yes, the journalists are free to reveal the source if they want, and only if they want. However, they want the International Criminal Tribunals to help with them in their investigation and to prosecute these people, in which case they would have to follow the justice of the International Criminal Tribunals and its system. By using their service, they would have to follow their terms and conditions. And one of their terms and conditions, in my opinion, for the sake of justice and for the sake of truthfulness and credibility of the International Criminal Tribunals, is to show the source of the evidence. Also, our opponent have also said that these sources might be threatened. However, it actually takes more resources to protect a lot of forensic evidence and to preserve the bodies of those who have died from the genocide in comparison to one source, one person from threats and blackmail. This was mentioned by our second speaker in the Deputy Prime Minister's speech. And so, Judge, clearly, we are the ones who provide a more compelling argument in the metric of protecting the victim and in the metric of providing justice. And so, Judge, it is clear that the government side has won today's debate. Thank you.